I'm new to this. Yeah, okay. It's sponsored by the Washburn Area Historical Society and the Washburn Heritage Association. And this series has been made possible by a grant from the Apostle Islands Historic Preservation Conservancy. And the music this evening will be provided by Rick Yeoman and sponsored by the Washburn Area Historical Society. We're also going to have about a 10-minute break at about 8 o'clock. So you can get up and get some food, do whatever you want for a few minutes. Our technical assistance tonight is provided by Lynn Adams and Andrew Grimm. Again, thank you to the Harvard View for hosting this series. And we hope you can join us in 2 weeks on July 25th for one of those sprays presentation on lumber business and living in Washington around 1900, also known as and we also, beyond that, we have 4 series, so we also have one each week on Tuesday night after that. One is the history of Washburn's walking trail. That'll be on August 1st, and on August 8th, it'll be called Tracing the History of the Old Broken Down Palace Site. Although Pete's professional career has been in the fields of environmental science and public administration, he delights in the exploration of place, inquiring about why communities are the way they are. He has been fascinated with heritage since he was 7 on the shores of the Washburn. The area had yet to be modernized and like his hometown.
Thank you, David. One of the buildings in Washburn I've always been fascinated with was the Carnegie Library building. And so I had the opportunity to dig around a little bit into the foundation, if you will, the beginning of the Washburn Public Library. Today, the Washburn Library is housed in a magnificent 113-year-old structure. It's about 6,800 square feet. That was a gift of an immigrant who believed libraries were an important attribute in the education of mankind and the necessity of sustaining the American democracy.
Could you speak louder, please?
The Washburn Library building has been referred to by Lars Larson. The Washburn Library building has been referred to by Lars Larson in his memoirs of the history of this community as the last of 4 examples of monumentalism constructed in the public buildings of Washburn, a way of expressing confidence in the city's great future. Today, this structure serves as patrons with over 26,000 volumes of material, including 20,900 books, 2,000 CDs and audio materials, 3,200 DVDs, and provides access to the resources of 30 libraries within 8 northern Wisconsin counties. In 1886, the year the electors of this settlement instructed the town board to establish a library, it consisted of a meager shelf of books in the town clerk's office. This evening's tale of the story of the founding of the Washburn Public Library and the early years of its service to our community is the subject of my presentation this evening. Before though, seeing how I tend to get long-winded, and I see faces in this audience that enjoyed my previous presentation on the city's namesake, Cadwalader, Washburn. I've had to cut my program back a little bit to just include the early years of the Washburn Library and not the entire history of the library. Charles Twining, a professor of history at Northland, wrote in his book, Downriver, the history of the Empire Lumber Company, that whatever else history may be, it's always generalizations. And I have to say that I admire historians that can get through the minutia of digging through the past and really providing a cohesive story that moves right along, and I'll try to do that this evening. But because I am long-winded, I'd like to extend some thanks right here at the beginning of the program, and particularly Lars Larson for his memoir, The Community, Tony Wyack, who's published several books in our community that I use for my research, the Washburn Women's Civic Club, the publisher, I believe, of a centennial history of the city, the Area Research Center down at the Great Lakes Visitor Center, Attorney Scott Clark for use of his law library, Tammy DeMars and Scott Hoover of City Hall staff who gave very generous access to city records, Susan McGrath, who of the Washburn Historical Society, who came across a number of items related to Greenwood, and Daryl Pendergrass, the director of the Washburn Library. When I first approached Daryl about this program, he produced the publication, and it was this ancient book from 1891. I have the wrong date on my slide here, I'm sorry. It's 1891 to 1958, and it's the record book of the Washburn Free Public Library and Reading Room. Daryl told me that a few years ago, a resident of the community presented him with this book. They purchased it at a garage sale in town and felt that it was more valuable in his hands than with whoever had it. And I'm grateful for Daryl's presentation or access to that particular document. Libraries are as old as civilization, and they're a collection of ideas and information that people have accumulated and put together in one form or another. But generally, the earliest libraries weren't lending libraries. They were just libraries that people accessed at various locations, a reference library, essentially. In North America, the earliest libraries were in seminaries and academic institutions. The types of libraries in this country that were in other locations were subscription libraries, somewhat like the library company in Philadelphia that Ben Franklin helped start, which you paid dues to this organization and they permitted you access to the resources within that library. There were rental libraries in North America where you didn't pay dues, but you paid a fee for access to a book. Mercantile libraries were also present. The earliest school libraries in the public school system didn't appear until 1831. And finally, YMCAs had libraries as early as 1851. But again, few of these were lending libraries. Lending libraries really didn't come on the scene until the 1880s. The town of Washburn, the town that was the giant geographic area around the settlement of Washburn, wasn't created till 1884. Washburn's settlement was here as early as 1883, and the geographic area that the town of Washburn was composed of included the town of Bayview, the current town of Washburn, the town of Barksdale, and even the town of Eileen. It was a large geographic area with a small urban footprint within it. The first election of town officers occurred in 1884, and the first sawmill was constructed here. If you follow Lars Larson's timetable, it was the S.G. Cook Mill in the same year. 2 years later, the electors of this community decided that they wanted the library. And they voted in a special election in April of that year. And there were a whole 97 votes cast. If you can picture this large geographic area. 97 votes, of which 96% voted in favor of establishing a library.
Well, we could try yelling. Is that any better?
Hey, that's really good.
Yelling into the mic? Okay. I don't know what prompted this settlement to establish a library. The research that I've done doesn't really indicate the reason why, but Washburn was a boom town. It was a rowdy community, and there were limited recreational opportunities. In 1889, there were 11 saloons in this town, and we hadn't even reached our maximum population yet. The research that I've done has indicated that deviltry among young people was a widespread concern. But then there were altruistic reasons for establishing a library as well. Folks wanted a sense of a permanent established community. They wanted the cultural institutions that established communities had. So in 1886, they made use of Section 38, Chapter 38 of Wisconsin statute, which permitted communities to establish public libraries. And the statute says that towns can vote by ballot to establish a town library for the use of people thereof, and when established, to make all bylaws, rules, and regulations for the management thereof, and raise a sum not exceeding $150 per year for purchasing books, purchasing a place, furnishing a place to keep such a library, and paying the librarian for his services to be expended upon the direction of the town board. There was another statute in Wisconsin on libraries, and that was the statute that our namesake, Cadwalader Coleman Washburn, signed in 1872. And this was a law that was introduced by an assemblyman from Janesville, Wisconsin, that enabled every community, every city and village in the state to establish a public library that is forever free. I'm kind of curious as to why Washburn did not use that statute. I think it's because in Wisconsin law, cities and villages are often have different laws than town government has. And why the state made that distinction, I don't know, but that's one of the holes in this particular story. I just want to give you an idea how much was the town budget in 1886. The town appropriated $5,100 for municipal operations that year. The general fund was $1,000, roads and bridges were $2,000, the school fund was $2,000, and the library was $150. The town designated its city clerk, L.N. Clausen, as the first librarian in the city in December of 1886. This was about 8 months after the town established the library. The only public building in Washburn at that time was the Pioneer School building. And this was up on where the courthouse is at the present time. And it was constructed in 1885. And the source material I use does not make it clear whether city offices were in the Pioneer School and a vacant classroom or not. But it appears that the Pioneer School was a location of the first library. In the spring of 1887, the library was moved to the town office building, which was then under construction. And that was at the corner of 2nd Avenue. Well, this was Pioneer School's location again, where the courthouse is. But the town home was in the corner of 2nd Avenue East at Bayfield Street. It's the site of the current Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources building. And it was a 2-story structure you see in the picture. It was commissioned in 1886, but did not open until May 14th of 1887. The town purchased a couple of lots at 2nd Avenue East of Bayfield Street, and then they bonded for $10,000 to build this building. It had a banking apartment on the first floor. In the front of the building, where you see the Bank of Washburn sign in the picture, police and fire departments. The police and fire departments were located at the rear of the first floor, and the selected floor was occupied by a society hall, a municipal court, and town offices. Clausen's office was on the 2nd floor of this building, in what was called the GAR room, the Grand Army of the Republic room. But I'm not sure if that was a society hall or another office in that building. Clausen was reappointed librarian in May 2nd, 1887. The library terms under Section 38 of statutes were 1 year, and librarians had to be reappointed every year. And they were also town officers, just like a town supervisor or a town chairman or a town clerk. At that time, the library consisted of 160 books, including the classics and favorites of the era. This is the DNR building that's on that corner at the present time. In May of 1888, a gentleman by the name of F.T. Yates was appointed as our librarian. He was born in 1867 in Wales, England, immigrated to Chicago with his family, and in 1881 moved to River Falls, where he became a printer's devil in a local newspaper office. At age 18, he moved to Bayfield and began working for the Bayfield County Press. In October of '87, he arrived in Washburn and established a new newspaper in town called the Washburn News. He constructed a brownstone building on Bayfield Street at 16 Bayfield Street East in 1889. In 1908, he sold the paper and moved to Twin Cities. Why he wanted to be the librarian, I don't know. He was new to town. Perhaps he was looking for something to supplement his income for his newly established enterprise. Perhaps he thought that being the librarian would be a marketing tool for his newspaper. I really don't have any idea. His office again was 16 Bayfield Street East. He wasn't the librarian for very long. He was appointed in May, and on September 14th of 1888, the entire block between Bayfield Street, Omaha Street, Central Avenue, and First Avenue East burned. That was the Great Fire of 1888. I would just like to give you a brief description of that fire, according to Lars Larson. As soon as it was generally known that the town was on fire and in danger of entire devastation, excitement ran high, and it was impossible to gather a force of men to do any good in any particular direction. The great rush of the masses seemed to be for the saloons where beer ran free as water. The flames from the burning barns soon communicated with other buildings in the vicinity, and in less time than it takes to write this article, Block 29 was being mowed down by the fierce flames. I should say that that was the account that was in the Ashland newspaper, and they referred to Block 29. Unfortunately, that is not Block 29, that was Block 59. So even historical accounts aren't necessarily entirely accurate. The fire started about 2:30 a.m. within a barn owned by a future member of the library board, Mr. Peter Nelson, near the southwest corner of Block 59. And this was the community's principal business block. In 90 minutes, over 40 business buildings were destroyed, including the library, telephone exchange, the opera house, offices of 2 Washburn newspapers, the barber shop, several saloons, retail establishments, and boarding houses, a blacksmith shop, and many homes. Spot fires also occurred in the blocks surrounding the main fire block. The building that's at that site now is the family dentistry office. And this particular building housed FTE's business, the Washburn News, and it was constructed in 1889 after the newspaper, or after the fire. What happened to the library between the night of the fire and 1891, I have no idea. I have not found whether Washburn had a library during that time period. The city's attention wasn't really on library services after the fire. It was on providing enhanced fire protection for the community, building a water system, building hose houses to hire the chemical pumpers that the city purchased for use in fighting fires in the community. But then again, in 1892, there's a reference to the library being moved back to the old town hall, and the electors voted $1,200 for a public free library and reading room. They also established a library board, which seems to follow the pattern of the 1872 Wisconsin library law. I have not been able to determine when that law might have been amended to permit townships to establish libraries under its auspices. But December 29, 1891, at 8 p.m., the first meeting of the Board of Directors of the Washburn Free Library and Reading Room convened. It was an independent board appointed by the town board. And this board was responsible for hiring of a librarian, for oversight of staff, for approving expenditures of day-to-day operations and long-term planning for the library. It consisted of 9 members. A.C. Probert, if you remember that name from Washburn's history, was appointed the temporary chair of the board to preside over the organizational meeting. Probert, if you recall, operated and established the Bank of Washburn. He also was involved in several of the community's enterprises, including the Electric Power Company, the Washburn Brewing Company, the Washburn Manufacturing Company, and several other businesses. He was the agent for the Bayland and Improvement Company. And by mid-1893, if you recall a previous presentation in this history series, Probert's financial affairs were in tatters, and he gained a lot of notoriety his handling of his affairs. They also appointed John Jacobs to the library board. He was one of the city's first, or the town's first settlers, arriving here in 1883. And he was the proprietor of a confectionery and produce store on Bayfield Street. He also established a small lumber mill in town with a partner, and he was active in logging operations within the area. Another person who was appointed was Lorenzo M. Clausen. If you remember him, he was the first librarian, the first city clerk. He was one of Washburn's most distinguished and colorful citizens. Clausen was a successful local businessman in the field of insurance and real estate. He planted an addition to the original plat of the town site. And on July 7, 1897 issue of the Washburn Times notes that he offered the services of fire, life, and accident insurance, real estate, and collections. He went on to become a postmaster in town. He was secretary of the Board of Education, and in 1904 he ran for the state assembly. Another individual was Peter Nelson. He was owner of the downtown hardware store and adjacent barn where the Great Fire of 1888 was said to have originated. And Kenny was another appointee who served as an assessor for the city of Washburn. Additional people on the board included E.S. Owen, Nelson, another Nelson in town, and Ed Hansen, and a man by the name of Herman Facey. Their first order of business was to divide the 9-member board into different classes and staggered terms. And so they drew lots, and Probert, Owen, and Jacobs became the class of 1892, a one-year term.
Pete, I think your voice is louder than the microphone.
Distraction and improvement with my talking. The second order of business was the election of officers via secret ballot. A.C. Probert was elected president and J.A. Jacobs elected as secretary.
That's great. We hear you.
We'll see if I keep it up. E.S. Owen, after the bylaws were approved and the office of vice president was created, was appointed as the board's first vice president. The committee, or I should say the board, also appointed a committee to develop bylaws. And just 22 days later, the board met to approve the bylaws. They chose to vote on each article individually, which I think must have resulted in an awful tedious meeting. But the bylaws provided an organizational structure for the board and rules for the operation of the library. As I mentioned, the bylaws added another officer of vice president that E.S. Owen was elected to fill. The bylaws established 3 committees. And it's kind of interesting, the names of these committees. It wasn't establishing a library committee or a rooms committee. It was, they established the on-library committee and the on-rooms committee and the on-finance committee. And if you talk about micromanaging, the library committee was to superintend the position of books on shelves. They were to prepare a catalog of holdings, make temporary changes to rules and duties of the library. The rooms committee would have general charge of the rooms, attend to lighting and warming of the rooms, provide all fixtures for the preservation of books, attend to repairs and bindings of books, prepare rules for keeping order in rooms. And the finance committee, of course, did what a finance committee does, examines all bills, employ all means necessary to secure donations and monies for the operation of the library. A month later, they appointed a woman in town, Miss Elvira Hall, as the librarian of the community's library, effective April 1st, 1892. And her annual salary was $400 per year. They also at that meeting decided that they were going to publish all the rules and bylaws of the library for access of members of the community. And so they published 500 copies of the rules and regulations. And this is the front of that public pamphlet that's at the library. And it was published in Wisconsin by E.R. Behringer Printer in 1892. And the back cover listed all the officers and the board of directors of the library. And I just want to mention a couple of the rules that were within that publication before I get too far ahead of myself here. It says that any resident or sojourner in the town of Washburn over the age of 14 may draw books from the library, provided rules are strictly complied with. Patrons can't handle books on shelves. That was the custom of the first libraries, first public libraries. You did not have access to the bookshelves. You told the librarian what book you wanted, and the librarian went to the shelf and picked it out and provided it to you. Only one volume could be borrowed for a maximum of 14 days, and it could be renewed for an additional 7 days. That seems to be a standard that is, at least was maintained through my early years. Fines were $2 cents per day, and overdue notices to be immediately mailed by the librarian with postage added to the fine. And this is intriguing, the next one. Now remember, this is a very large geographic area. We're not talking about the urban footprint of this community. We're talking about all the land area around here in several townships. Books not returned are to be retrieved by the librarian. An expense charged to the user. 20 cents for each book within the half mile of the library, and 10 cents for each additional mile or fraction thereof. All books were to be returned annually for inspection 2 weeks before July's annual meeting, and a $1 charge would be assessed if they weren't returned. There was to be no conversation in the reading room. The librarian was to be appointed annually by ballot, and the librarian was the custodian of all materials in the reading room, including paintings, engravings, maps, minerals, and prehistoric and agricultural specimens. The next activity of the library board was to find a new location for a library building. And they again put together a special committee, and on January 19th, they told the special committee to report back in 6 days on a proposed location for a library building. They looked at various properties in town, and they looked specifically to lands of the Bay Land Improvement Company, which was lots 15 and 16 of block 41 of the plat of Washburn for the library. And this was, or is, where the library, where the City Hall building is at present, at the corner of Washburn, or Washington and Bayfield Street. The Bay Land and Improvement Company was not very prompt in responding to the board's request, and they seemed to be in a rush to get the site established for this new library, so they decided to, they couldn't wait for a response from the company, and somebody suggested purchasing property from Gilbert Olson instead. Now this is in January of 1892. Well, they didn't get very far with talking to Mr. Olson as well. So in the spring of 1892, they were back in contact with the Bay Land Improvement Company, and they asked Probert to be their middleman in discussing things with the company. And so at a special meeting on June 21st, the special committee reported to the board that the Bay Land Improvement Company would donate lots 15 and 16 to the library for the balance due. The minutes of the library board don't give a definition of what that meant, but getting a clear title to this property was problematic for a number of years. There were conditions on the donation. The building had to be constructed of brick or stone. It had to be used as a library. And there was a reversion clause that said that the Land Improvement Company would get it back if it wasn't used for a library. And the deed was to be provided on completion of the building. Well, now they were satisfied that they had the location, but they didn't want the whole lot. If you look at a plat of the city, the lots run north to south in this particular location. And they wanted to sell off the rear half of this lot for some other use. And they just wanted to keep what was referred to as the front of the lot. And the front of the lot faced Pine Street. I don't know if they ever really followed through with that. But the library building is the green square, where the green square was built. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. There is a photograph, which I thought was the next slide, but it isn't, of another building in this general area down here, which was said to have been the post office in the early years of the city. The building location committee was dissolved, and the city pursued a building committee to get the building under construction. The committee consisted of Probert, Hanson, and Jacobs. They contacted an architect in Ashland, O'Connor, Porter, and Padley, to try to get a probable cost of the building. And they consulted the architect on plans for the building as well. And one interesting thing happened shortly after that meeting. It had nothing to do with the building. But I think the library board came to the realization that they had hired a librarian, and there really wasn't a whole lot for that librarian to do. Either that or it was the first instance of the board discriminating against women, I don't know which. But at the annual meeting the following month, they cut the salary of the librarian, Elvira Hull, to $200. And they set her salary, or they reduced her salary to $200 until January 1st of 1893. They further extended her salary, her rate at $200 a year rather, until the new library building was completed. But just before the new library building was completed, they fired her essentially. And they hired another individual for the position, which we'll get to in a second. The board explored other libraries, particularly the Hayward Library, to see what they wanted. And they finally, in August of that year, 1892, they submitted plans and specs to the board for review. On August 29th, they instructed the architects to make changes to reduce building costs. And after they revised the plans, they put the building out to bid. And they received only one bid for the building from a company called Windall & Company for $3,200. It was an interesting discussion we had at the meeting where bids were collected, or bids were opened, because the minutes report that they had an animated discussion about the bids and about their authority to spend money without town board approval. They concluded that they didn't have any rights to expend money for the building. And so they appointed again a committee of 3 to approach the town board for assistance. They also asked their architect to reduce expenses of the building once again. And so the board revised the plans with the architect who attended that meeting. Also, the town chair attended that meeting, a Mr. W.S. Raitt, and he gave assurances that the town board would cooperate with any action made unanimously by the library board. So the building committee was directed to secure new bids, and a month later, they again only got one bid from Windall & Company for $3,200. So I'm not sure whether Windall bid $3,200 on the modified plans that reduced the scope of the work, or whether this $3,200 was for the plans that were reviewed at the earlier meeting. Finally, they did get town board approval to move forward, and the building committee was instructed to enter into a contract with the company for construction of the building. And as soon as the town board gave its final authority, the building committee was given full authority to construct the library building. All bills were to be reviewed by the finance committee before payment. And finally, now we're to January of 1893, and the building committee was asked to make all possible effort to have the building completed by April 1st. But absenteeism was getting to be a problem for the board. There were often, many times, the board never had a quorum, which was 5 members established by the bylaws. And finally, at the January meeting, it was proposed that each board member who did not attend a meeting be fined 50 cents for his or her absence. The the motion didn't go anywhere and was defeated. The minute book that I described before does list all the individual bills for the new library building. And though I'm sure you can't read them, it is interesting when you have a chance to look at the book. They talk about, I don't know, Harley or Haley Brothers poured floor for Wendell and Company, $6. Tom Nelson framing for Wendell and Company, $60. Morris Company, and I really can't make out the word, $64.27. Freight for L.N. Clausen, expenses and taxes paid $32. And it goes through the whole list of expenses over the next ensuing months for charges that were incurred for the library building itself. Finally, the library wasn't completed by April of '93 as they requested, and a dispute erupted with the library architect. The minute book just kind of lists rather cryptic descriptions of actions the library board took. It didn't really give full thoughts as to why the library board was undertaking a particular action. And there is a cryptic message in May that a dispute erupted with the library architect, and the building committee was instructed to take the library out of the architect's hands as soon as possible, provided that upon consultation with the town attorney it would be so advised. And then there's another cryptic message that says Kinney was appointed to a committee of one to determine where the materials were taken to. And so I don't know if materials were missing from the site or disappearing from the site or not. But then later on they mentioned that the bricks were returned to the site. So apparently somebody was moving materials from the site, and it wasn't necessarily the architect, but the architect was supposed to be overseeing the project. Finally, in July of 1893 at the annual meeting, there was competition for the librarian's position. A number of individuals applied for the position: August Kelstrup, Elvira Hull, E.J. Lamb, J.B. Beaudrew, and John Savage. An informal ballot elected John B. Savage as the librarian on July 10th, 1893. Now remember, I told you they cut Elvira Hull's salary from $400 to $200. They hired John Savage at $400. And yet, he didn't really seem competent as a librarian, because the library opened in September, and they hired the Ashland librarian to come and set up the new library for additional cost, and then they hired outside people to develop the library. So the building that they ended up constructing, and it was occupied in September of '93, is the brick portion of what is now the Washburn City Hall. It was a single-story building. It did not have a basement at that time. It did not have utilities. And that was one of the intriguing things about this building as well. It wasn't until after the building was constructed and opened that somebody decided, well, you know, we have an electric utility in town. Maybe we need to put electric lights in this building. And somebody else felt, well, gee, you know, we really ought to have water in this building too. Let's put in a drinking fountain. And somebody else decided, well, you know, we ought to hook up to the city sewer and maybe even put a water closet in this building. And they didn't build a restroom in there. They put a water closet, according to the minutes, in the director's room and hung a curtain around it. And I think with that, I think it's time that David probably wants us to have an intermission. So, hope everybody's been refreshed. We'll get started again. This is a photograph that I stole out of one of Tony Wyack's books. which shows the library building on the right-hand side and what he calls the post office building on the left, at the corner of Bayfield and Washburn, Bayfield, Washington. If you notice, the roof on the library building was kind of a hip roof on the building. It was a tin roof that they had trouble with leakage, and they painted it, it seemed like every couple of years to keep it looking nice. There's certainly a different roof on that building now. City Hall, or the stone part of the library building, was built, I believe, in the 1920s from stone that was dismantled from the Northern States Bank building, which was where the BP station is now. The dormers over the doors were added, I don't know, about 2003, 2004, after the roof itself was strengthened because it was starting to sag so badly and water was not draining from the flat roof that is on top of the building. We mentioned before that books were selected by patrons of the library through the use of a catalog. And a catalog for the early Washburn Library is not available, but this is a catalog from the Eau Claire Library from 1882. And if you can read at all the titles that are on the pages, I don't know what the numbers are referred to on the right, but nothing is in alphabetical order. The authors are on the left in italics. The name of the book is, the publication is in the middle. And I think that the numbers were a location on the shelf where the book could be found. But it did categorize things by subject. And it did list all the magazines, as you see here on this page on the right, that were in the collection as well. An interesting thing occurred in the minute books from 1893, which if anybody here can help me out with, I certainly appreciate. Again, it's difficult to read from where you are, but they started adding discounts to bills. A discount to me means that you're getting a reduction of a bill. But these discounts were added to the bill. For example, John Jacobs' salary as secretary, $25. They paid the secretary of the board $25 a year for his service. And in the line under that is the discount for $2.17. I don't understand that concept. And the discount varied from 10% one year to 2% another year to 3% on another year after that. If anybody can give me any insight into what is happening here, I very much appreciate it. What was really interesting is that in 1894, there were problems with materials that started appearing in the library. And again, there's no explanation in the minute book of the library as to what was happening. There was just this resolution that was introduced by Mr. Jacobs that says, whereas certain papers of an obnoxious and insulting character to a large portion of our people are placed in the files in the reading room, and whereas the reading room and library is supported by a direct tax on all people, therefore be it resolved that we, the board of directors of the Washburn Free Library and Reading Room, believing in the spirit of fairness and not desiring to see any visitor to the reading room insulted on account of his nationality or religion, hereby direct the librarian to place no paper or periodical on the files that is of the character mentioned above. There wasn't any second for this resolution that was introduced by Jacobs. It was referred to a committee, and they were instructed to report at the next meeting. If you look in Larson's book, again, his memoir of the community, he does make mention that in 1894, the community had visitors that were trying to stir up anxiety and discrimination against Catholics. And I just wonder if perhaps there was material by these visitors to the community that started appearing in the library that started offending the board as well. The committee did report back to the full board, and it recommended not adopting the resolution. Jacobs made the motion anyway to adopt it, and it failed. It only received one vote, and that was Jacobs himself.
Okay.
In the library was heated with coal, as was most of Washburn. If you didn't have a wood stove, you had a coal stove. And the library solicited bids for coal. And Northwestern Fuel Company, which was down here at the marina, just about where the marina building is now, was the company that virtually always got the coal contracts. The Northwestern Coal Company was a company out of St. Paul, Minneapolis that was created in 1877 by a merger of 4 distributors in the Twin Cities. And its purpose was to monopolize the anthracite distribution in the upper Mississippi Valley. There were some interesting names associated with the company, and James J. Hill was one of them, the Empire Builder and the owner of the Great Northern Railway. Another gentleman by the name of Mr. Griggs, Chauncey Griggs, out of Cumberland, Wisconsin, was a partner of the company. Chauncey owned a lumber mill in Cumberland, and he later moved his business to Tacoma, Washington, and had one of the largest lumber mills on the West Coast. It's amazing how much coal the library building utilized. Coal was about $5.50 to $7 a ton during this era, and they used anywhere from 19 to 24 tons a year to heat the library building. What's also interesting is I've never burned coal. I never grew up in a house that used coal, but they don't refer to the heating system in the library as a boiler system. It's a coal furnace is what they refer to it as. And so it gives me the impression that it's some type of gravity heat furnished by this furnace, but remember they didn't have electricity in the original library building. That was added later on. So they didn't have any fans to blow heat. The heating system, though, was just plain inadequate in the building. It did not adequately heat the library building, and so they thought that by digging a basement under the building, they could solve that problem. Not only did they have to purchase the coal, they had to drag it from the coal dock to the library building. And more often than not, when you look through the bills that the monthly board meetings approve, you'll find William Olson's drainage bill as part of that, with a description of bringing the coal from the dock to the library building. And I suppose that we have descendants of Mr. Olson in the room with us this evening. As I mentioned, they decided to dig a basement under the library building. And now remember, the library building's built over, and now they're going to dig a hole underneath this thing to house the heating system and whatever else they want to store down there. So they dug a basement that runs the entire length of the building from the wall on Washington Street to the rear wall, but only about 10 feet wide. And that was then utilized to put the coal furnace in and to heat the building. But again, it did not really provide a lot of adequate heat for the structure. In 1896, they finally decided to change librarians again, and Ruth Gifford was appointed the librarian. They also gave her a salary of $400 a year, and And then there were some notes in the minutes that there were some disagreements developing between the library board and the village, no, excuse me, and the town, about how the town handled library monies. And the board sent off an epistle to the town board saying that they wanted library funds kept in a separate fund from the town's general operating fund. They also started publishing their annual reports in the local newspaper. And another picture of the basement of the building as it appears today. Stone walls with just some mason cement covering the stone on the inside of the structure. They published reports in the annual paper about the volumes of books kept in the library. And in this table, you'll see in 1888, they had 160 volumes. By 1897, they increased the collection to 1,187. They had 37 different periodicals. Their circulation was 4,600 annually, or about 12.7 users per day. But what is really interesting is the library board approved the periodicals that were going to be kept in the library annually in December or January. And in the January 27th, 1897, they approved all these particular periodicals, these monthly publications, weekly publications, and daily publications. But the annual report that was submitted by the librarian in July of that year listed a number of additional publications. The red text you see were the publications that were approved in January, and the black words you see on this particular slide were additional publications that the annual report reported that they had in the library. Of the list of 1,180 some volumes in the library, literature consisted of 633 history, 125 volumes of history, 34 juvenile books, 69 biographies, 312 miscellaneous, 14 were discarded, 8 were lost, and 21 were rebound by the library board. In 1898, the library board finally changed librarians again. And on July 11th of that year, Greenwood was hired as the town's librarian. She started work at the library. I don't have a younger picture of May. This was taken from a May Greenwood book that was on file at the Historical Society that Susan McGrath made me aware of. May was born in Downsville, Wisconsin in 1869 as May Maria Smith. She was the daughter of George and Maria Smith. The reason she came to Washburn is that her sister was married to William Irish. Irish later became a mayor of the city of Washburn, one of the early mayors. And when she visited her sister in town, she met a gentleman by the name of Richard Greenwood and was married to Richard Greenwood in November of 1887. He came to Washburn from England in 1884. That's 1 year after this community was founded. And he operated the Washburn Meat Market, which ironically was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1888. It was never rebuilt. The Greenwoods lived in a home on 4th Street, which still stands, 214 4th Street East. Richard Greenwood died at the age of 35 on February 23rd, 1896. He had a prolonged illness, though there's no mention in the newspaper accounts or other records I've looked at as to what that illness is. It does mention that he went to St. Paul for treatment that didn't do any good, and he died sitting up in his bed eating supper without warning. His funeral was presided over by the Reverend Franco Rector of the Bayfield Episcopal Church. It was said to have been the largest funeral ever held in Washburn. And what I don't understand is they say the funeral was held at the Bayfield Episcopal Church, but yet it was the largest funeral gathering in Washburn. I don't quite understand that. It had a large number of intimate friends in attendance, including 44 Oddfellows members, 14 Rebecca's members, 68 Woodsman members, and 40 firemen. Mr. Greenwood was buried in the Greenwood Cemetery in Bayfield, which is an interesting thread, and I don't know what the connection is with that. From the Untitled and Undated History of the Library, written by May Greenwood, she said that boys hung out at the library all the time and chewed tobacco, and they spit the tobacco juice in the heating pipes. The library had 24 cuspidors, and she was responsible for cleaning them. Again, May, in one of the many newspaper articles that was written by Chip Sheridan, as Washburn at the time was a lusty young lumbering center, many of the library patrons were mill hands and lumberjacks who liked the tobacco raw and in the cheap. Between every pair of high back chairs in the reading room, recalled Mrs. Greenwood, was a cuspidor for the preservation of our flora and the convenience of those who wanted to feel thoroughly at home. These had to be cleaned regularly, and the job was not all that to our liking. But we bore that cross with fortitude, if not with patience, until a kindly library inspector gave us courage of our convictions. We hid the cuspidors, and from then on our patrons had to do their expectorating elsewhere. I don't believe the improvement in manners reduced our patronage anyway. The librarian was also the janitor. She was responsible for cleaning the library. The library was open some 10 hours a day, Monday through Saturday, and 3 hours on Sunday at the time of Mrs. Greenwood's hiring. There weren't any other staff in the library. She was it. She did everything. She shoveled coal into the furnace. She's the one who cleaned out the cuspidors. She was the janitor that scrubbed the floors, and she was the person that checked out books for people. She certainly was a dedicated public servant. It wasn't until 1916 that she was given a day off. Again, from the Untitled, Undated History of the Library, written by Greenwood, I still remember how scared I was that I would not be able to run the furnace, and I remember that my salary was $33.33 per month. I could close my eyes and see the dirty floor. It had to be scrubbed each morning. And an extremely cold morning, I would forget to feel important and gay because I would feel so chilled before I could get the building warmed up. And then when she was hired, she was informed by the secretary of the library board that the librarian was to furnish the cleaning supplies for keeping the library clean. This, however, was changed at the next board meeting. Our board met every month. The president, Mr. Harada, of the board instructed the secretary to inform the librarian that they would provide the supplies. The only problem I have with Mrs. Greenwood's recollection is that I didn't find any evidence of a Mr. Harada being on the library board, nevertheless an officer of the board. At the time that she was hired, an F.W. Frost, L.W. Frost was the secretary of the board, and the president was J.E. Jones. There was a Mr. Hartshorn that was elected vice president in July of 1900, about a year after, well, 2 years after she was hired. The main part of the building, according to Mrs. Greenwood, again, this is a current picture of the council chambers of the Washburn City Hall. The building does extend about another 10, maybe 15 feet to the right of this picture, but this is taken from the front entrance of the building on Washington Street. According to Greenwood, there were 1,099 volumes of books that were kept in a fireproof vault. The librarian's desk that kept the public out of the vault. Every night there would be a turkey red curtain drawn across the books inside the vault to keep dust off the books. And the vault was locked when the librarian was not present in the building. I'm trying to picture a fireproof vault in this building. Having prowled around in this building in the attic above the council chambers and in the basement and looking through the crawl space, I mean, this is a wood frame structure essentially with a brick veneer on the outside. I honestly don't see how you could have a fireproof vault in here. Certainly there was a separate room for the books. I suspect that room was off to the right someplace where the restrooms in the building are now. But I doubt that it was fireproof. The minutes of the library board do mention that the school debating society met in the back room of the library, which would have been someplace behind the council's table there. Some type of meeting room might have been back there. But the bulk of this building was the reading room for the library. November 14th, 1960, the city held a May Greenwood Day to honor May Greenwood. She'd been on the job since 1898. She had been trying to resign that position for 15 years. And this is one of the other curiosities of Mrs. Greenwood. She would say she'd been here long enough, she'd submit a letter of resignation to the library board. The library board would tell her, no, we're not going to let you resign. You've got to hang around here a little bit more. And she'd hang around. So I was telling Mr. McGrath here earlier, I think if I wanted to resign a job and the board told me no, I just walk out the door. I wouldn't hang around. Susan McGrath did find a newspaper article in the collection of material that she provided me relate to May Greenwood that I would just like to read a little bit about because it's rather interesting. After she had put in 50 years on the job, Mrs. Greenwood suggested that she'd like to give up her duties and take things easy. I think this was written by Chick Sheridan, though it doesn't have a byline on the article. The board poo-pooed the notion. After all, she wasn't even 80 yet. When she reached 90, she pressed the matter more strongly, but the community response was a May Greenwood Day, hailing her as the oldest librarian in the nation with tributes from President Dwight D. Eisenhower, Vice President Nixon, and President-elect John F. Kennedy. But this summer, now this is, again, this article is not dated, but it's 4 years after May Greenwood Day, so we're talking about 1964 now. She's 94 years old. But this summer, Mrs. Greenwood, still notably vigorous in administering an annual circulation of more than 25,000 and guiding the reading habits of her contemporaries' great-grandchildren, made her finally play the retirement card due to ill health. The board capitulated. And what will Miss Greenwood do in retirement? A little reading. There's a book in the Historical Society that has all kinds of tributes to May Greenwood. On May Greenwood Day, they had an open house at the library, and then they had a program in the evening, though I don't know exactly where the program was held. It was sponsored by the Washburn Free Public Library and the Washburn Women's Study Group. And they had a musical presentation, a welcome from the Women's Study Group, a historical sketch of the Washburn Free Public Library by Charles Sheridan. I'd like to get my hands on that document. More music, presentation of letters, and a closing. And this book is full of cards, full of tributes, and there are interesting little things that you can pick out of there. A lot of them are remembrances of people that are no longer living in Washburn. They moved to the far reaches of this globe, but they sent a letter just describing an experience or a memory they had at the library, and it kind of adds a little bit of color, I think, to what the building was like and what the community was like. Chick Sheridan of the Library Board and Mrs. Earl Johnson of the Women's Study Group presented one of the congratulations to May Greenwood at this particular tribute. There were telegrams again and letters of tribute from all over the place. This particular one is from the Wisconsin Free Library Commission. What was really interesting is that Richard Nixon sent a letter of tribute, even though it was somewhat after the day of the event, December 22nd, 1960, instead of November 14th. She also got a letter from John F. Kennedy, who was at that time running for president. And she received a letter also from, the newspaper says Dwight D. Eisenhower. I did not find a letter from Dwight D. Eisenhower, though if I spent more time looking through the book, I might find it. They did find a letter from the White House, written by a special assistant in the White House, providing a tribute to May Greenwood. This is one of her resignation letters, dated June 1st, 1948. To the Board of Directors of the Washburn Public Library, Washburn, Wisconsin. I herewith submit my resignation as librarian of the public library to take effect September 4th, 1941. 48, excuse me. Again, she resigned from her position several times. This was not her earliest resignation. And her earliest one came in the 1920s when the library was going through all kinds of financial problems. Even though it was boom time in the country, Washburn was not faring very well in the post-World War environment. And when she offered a resignation in the 1920s because the library just couldn't afford to keep her on. And that story's for another time. I think with this discussion of May Greenwood, I'm going to wind things up. If I do, I'm fortunate enough to be invited back by the Historical Society and Heritage Association. We will continue on into the new century with the story of the Washburn Library. Thank you very much. If there are any questions,
Did you read the letters that people wrote? What did they remember about her? Was she warm? Was she?
Oh, she was fabulous.
Oh, how many people here knew her?
Oh, wow.
that was the question I was going to ask you. Thank you, Sheriff. Most folks in the letters, I did not read every letter in part.
Right, no, but she did a sprinkling.
The sprinkling of letters I did read had memories of being chased out of the library by Miss Greenwood for some type of misbehavior. There were a lot of notes of the fondness that folks had for the library, for Mrs. Greenwood's support of the library, and the benefits the library provided in their future lives. There were letters that indicated that kids like to walk around the stone lake. And she would come out chasing them off and that particular recreational activity. There were also notes about features of the library. For example, one note where John mentioned that he remembers this wrought iron fence around the 1893 library, which was City Hall building now. And he mentions that there was a wrought iron fence around both sides of the library. The minutes do mention the construction of a fence around the library building, but it really didn't go into much more detail than that. So that there's a little bit of additional information that can be cleared out of some of those letters.
But it was a cool place to hang out. This way.
It was. I was, a lady here during intermission came up and mentioned that she had heard that the library was a boys' club section. And I do recall reading something about that, that in the early years, boys were more welcome in the library than girls. And I don't know the reason why. The most popular book apparently in 1893, 1894, and was Mark Twain.